Thank you all for coming. My name is Carl Allen, and with me here is co-panelist David Dillman. I'll be doing a little more extensive introduction in just a sec. Today, we are here to spend a session talking about this idea of doing it yourself, starting your own bus operator. And Dave and I are going to be sharing our own personal experiences, both kind of the success stories and challenges that we've encountered, trying to pull this off or to varying degrees pulling off this idea. And so I'm excited to talk about it. Just a background again about Formative, and we do this is part of a series of webinars. We continue to do these about quarterly, but Formative is a manager of school transportation systems around the country for a lot of charter schools and other LEAs, and also do consultative work. And really our goal is thinking about how can student mobility be an asset and not a liability? How can it be leveraged to reduce access barriers and improve opportunities for students to achieve? Our work spans a lot of schools across a lot of cities, both on that managed service side and the consultative side. And again, today I'm joined by Dave Dillman. I'm the CEO of Formative, and I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota. I was formerly the Director of Transportation for Boston Public Schools, have also worked for a large private multimodal transit operator, operating both on-demand services, paratransit, and transit and rail services. That company's called Transdev. And then I have worked as a Chief of Operations and Finance for a charter school network as well, where I got to really experience the curbside realities that school leaders feel as it relates to transportation. And so that's informed a lot of my thinking in school transportation, and then thinking about, what do school leaders, charter leaders in particular, as I've also been in that district perch, but this is, there's some unique challenges for charter school leaders in particular as it relates to trying to solve this problem of transportation and managing outsourced vendors and so on. That kind of leads to the thinking and the idea, the opportunity that we're going to talk about today. So I started Formative 7 or so years ago, and you heard a little bit about Formative. Now I'll let Dave introduce himself.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Carl. So I'm the Director of Operations at Empower College Prep and the CEO of, sorry, I got to turn off the transportation radio. The CEO of Abundant Transportation, a nonprofit 509(a)(3) school bus provider in Phoenix. I manage all aspects of operations, the big O operations at Empower, from facilities to daily movement of people to technology and transportation. And it's through my experience doing that and hiring outside vendors to provide transportation services that it led me to apply for a grant, which is how I met Carl, because they were helping educate and help people think outside the box. And round one of a grant, and then got asked to write a follow-up grant in round 3 and won that to actually start Abundant. So
Great. So yeah, so Dave is a great success story of having pulled this concept off, this idea of kind of going it alone and starting your own bus operator to control your own destiny. So that's the topic of today. We are going to talk about the benefits, the challenges, and what does it take to do that as a school. So from the school perspective, how to take your transportation operation and own it, take it in-house, but a little bit different version of that, not just running an in-house operation, but actually starting a new entity that is a kind of a sister company or private transportation operator or some form of a transportation operator that can serve your school, but also potentially serve other schools. That is the concept as differentiated from just buying buses and running your own service. But it could be some version of it could be construed a lot of similarities. We're going to talk about the pain points and key challenges, kind of what leads to this opportunity. Why would you pursue it? You'll hear from Dave and me about our experiences, and then just talk about what are the keys to success, what needs to be true to make this sort of thing work, to pull it off. So just to share formatives framework, how we think about, why student transportation is so hard. It's, at a national level for operators and for just schools and those in the K-12 ecosystem, it's complicated from locality to locality. And then even within localities and states, there's different regulations, different requirements, inspections, and different requirements for drivers and things you can and cannot do, and funding mechanisms. And, depending on the kinds of school you are, if you're a charter versus a private, or a career and technical versus a district. So it's very complicated. And then it's a fragmented system. There isn't a school transportation transit authority running a network across a geography. Although I think that's someplace that that maybe the world could move towards. But rather, every school or district LEA has to figure it out themselves, and so everyone's kind of doing their own thing. Needs a transportation department, needs to find vendors and recruit drivers and do all these things. And therefore there are capacity gaps because this is not the core business of schools. So this is just not what schools are set up to do, but yet it's something you have to do. And furthermore, it's gotten more complicated. So these are the other now kind of exogenous elements that schools, LEAs have to deal with, is that demand has gotten more complicated. We hear a lot and have heard a lot in the news about driver shortages and cost increases and fuel increases. That's true. That's still there. But it's really about the demands of families, the expectations of families, students needing more individualized services and wanting them, has made it far. And, wanting GPS tracking and wanting updates about their kids and wanting flexible schedules. That's one of the biggest challenges that makes it harder to do the work. And then all these other problems, from market to market. It's also true that the environments for outsourced operators can be quite different from city to city, and whether there's a competitive, vibrant vendor marketplace. As in the Twin Cities, we have a lot of options, a lot of vendors in the marketplace, selling buses services and van services and so on. But in many other markets, that's not the case. And whether it's because of pattern of schools outsourcing historically, or how it's regulated and other kinds of barriers to entry for operators, it's just a real challenge. So why would schools consider this crazy strategy of doing it yourself? Well, one, they want to, they're dealing with these challenges. It's really hard, and they might have a lot of options. They want to control their own destiny. That's what that, icon is to suggest. They want to take control and stop, just being subject to these vagaries of their particular market. Can we do it ourselves? Can we take control? Then they'd like to have more control over the quality of service, right? They have a different standard. It's one of the reasons formative exists, is because we recognize that the vendor marketplace was, full of operators that didn't have the same a deep understanding or a learner-centric way of operating, an understanding of the needs and problems of schools, and a customer service mindset. And schools having that, can if they could figure out the operational stuff, feel like they could do a better job and give better service to families. And then if you can manage to do that, run a good, efficient operation, you can actually save money because you don't have an operator with a profit margin in the mix. And so that's true at scale. In-house operations that are efficient can be much less expensive than outsourcing, but there are a lot of benefits to outsourcing in terms of, outsourcing risk and so on. And it's not a core capacity of schools. So that's why there is a lot of outsourcing. But, it's true that if you've got the expertise, if you've got a Dave Dillman on staff that can do it, it can save you money as a school to run an operation. A lot of other things need to be true that we'll talk about, not the least of which is, you got to find a way to spread those costs out, or in the best case, get some offsetting revenue from other schools. Because if you're going to buy a bus and hire a driver, you probably as a single school can't use them full time, right? So you got to find a way to fill out their day and use those assets. And then that's when the economics really start to work for you. So that said, Dave gave you a little bit of an introduction, but I'd love to hand it to him and just kind of have you, Dave, share the story of Empower and then Abundant.
Yeah, thank you. So Empower College Prep has been around since 2012. We currently we're a single location K-12 charter school. Um, we have about 1,075 students, and we knew from the beginning that providing transportation would help us with a lot of things. One of them was we wanted to be large enough to make an actual impact in our area with a larger number. We wanted to be able to grow beyond one location, and we just saw that scaling was how we could get there. And so we came in with school buses being part of the equation. Now, after about um, 9 years of going through three different transportation providers, providing school buses with drivers, it always made my executive director and I extremely nervous that such a core component to having our students show up to school, and making sure they get there and making sure that since we knew transportation was so fundamentally important, that our low income population could make it to school, from further than 2 miles away, that it always made me nervous to be reliant on someone else whose number one driver is profit, which I can appreciate that, right? I mean, capitalism has made our country what it is, and I understand that everybody has to have, generally for businesses to function and thrive and want to keep going, they have to be able to turn a profit. And but it just never sat right with me that the organizations that were doing that were had that as a motive for why they existed. So I wanted to bring it in-house, but we ran into the capital expense of doing that with 6 routes. Then the fact that, it was a whole new aspect that was highly regulated to a different level. And then we had the driver shortage and everything else. And so back in 2021, I believe it was, uh, Arizona during COVID wrote into the legislature a grant, like a fund, in order to create innovation in transportation. And so schools had the ability to write to the grantor their proposal on what would be innovative. And for Empower, we got the costs. I read through the minimum standards for school busing, all 43 pages of it, and it was amazing to read. It was horrible to read, but you know, um, and we got to the end and we had our costs figured out and we had the general model figured out, but there was nothing innovative about it. And so I had told my executive director when we were 2 days away from turning in that grant proposal, I said, well, that's not innovative. We're just bringing it in-house to save money. Why would they give us that? And why would they give us any funds for that? And so I had said, let's just write it that if we can bring it in-house and we can do it successfully and we can save money, that we'll then work on starting a nonprofit transportation company. And so then we ran for about 2 years running that model, and we did very well. So the grantor came back and said, "Hey, write the proposal." So we did, and we won grant funds to start Abundant. And so here we are operating now. Part of the reason why my fear was to always bring it in-house was when I said transportation was a core aspect of getting our students to school, was I was extremely nervous, so was our executive director, about our school bus provider canceling our contract on us once he found out we were doing what we were doing. And unfortunately, he did mid-year. So on December 24th of 2021, I got a cancellation of contract notice for 60 days. So I ended up having to bring I already had buses lined up, but I didn't plan on taking ownership of them until the summer. I'd read everything I could, business model all figured out, even for internal, but I had 60 days to make it happen. So in that period of time from December 24th, 2021, which really means I had less than 60 days because it was the holidays, right? I interviewed 65 drivers, offered 21 offer letters, and still ended up with 5 drivers when we started on February 22nd, 2022. But we made it work. And we just went from there. And you don't know what you don't know until you learn it and you realize you don't know it, but you just got to keep moving forward. So we were able to lower our costs by, I think it was about 25% to bring it in-house. The big now running an external transportation company, one of the easiest ways we did that obviously was removing a profit motive because it was internal. But at the same time, I think the biggest savings bringing it internal came from general liabilities and auto insurance because right now, my GNLs for Abundant are multiplied factor over what we paid to just throw it on our umbrella, throw it on our SAM, throw it on our create auto policy for the 7, what we had at the time was 7 vehicles. So, I mean, at the end of the day, the reason why I think we were so successful at it is because I like to achieve things and get them done. But ultimately, for me, it was because even though I'm an administrator at a school, and I'm not a teacher, so I think very differently from everybody else that I work with, very differently. My team underneath me is not, they didn't, they had never had a desire to be teachers. So we just think very opposite of them, which is a great contrast. But we were able to start with scale, which meant our budgets that we were planning on spending, even internally, allowed me to not have to necessarily run the daily transportation because I could hire a transportation coordinator who could coordinate and run the daily and generally own the daily of all of that. Now, for my workload, that still meant in order to own the outcome of the success of what my internal vision fitting with what Empower is and how we operate our school, I still spent 15 to 20 hours a week working with that coordinator in order to make that happen. So, what that meant was that it was 55 to 60-hour weeks still once we brought it in house, but it was extremely successful. We were able to recruit more students from further out, snake our routes in a more aggressive pattern than we ever had before without having to have that push pull argument over mileage and time. We also were able to control our routes. One of the biggest things bringing it in house is we could pivot extremely quickly, whereas before, if we needed to add a stop, we could remove a stop with like overnight almost, right? Because it was saving the company money to remove a stop. If we wanted to add a stop, we had generally a week to 2 weeks of onboarding time in order to make that happen. So it allowed us to be very, very nimble internally, which for Abundant, I bring that same operational mindset to the nonprofit because I'm a school operator and I know what is important. And so that's, I think, part of the difference between us and our competitors that we currently, work with in Phoenix.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. I mean, it can't be overstated how big of an accomplishment it is. I mean, you had the support of A for Arizona, and we gave you some advice, right? But you really pulled it off and have run and created an impressive operation. So we'll get back to kind of summarizing your
Yeah.
keys to success. But I want to share a little bit then of, some of the flip side of where we've tried to pull it off in different instances and encountered some challenges and different reasons for that being in different marketplaces or having to do with different factors that we'll go through. But um, first, well, we've been thinking about this idea for a long time that that there might be a way, and this is Formative's model. One of our core parts of our model is to create aggregation and economies of scale, right? So networking schools together. We work with a lot of charter schools in the Twin Cities, plus Ramsey County and other non-school entities, and we can aggregate that demand and stack routes and get better pricing for everybody. Whereas in a lot of markets, other markets where there isn't the same kind of marketplace of schools and of charter schools, for example, and then maybe not a culture of like bell tiering, which there really is here. Schools are stuck paying full bore in many instances, full board for drivers and vehicles for the entire day, and pay on the order sometimes of twice what our schools in the Twin Cities pay. But if you're a school in the Twin Cities, you've got to find a complement. You've got to find a pair, a school that you can stack with or share with, like a district does, so that you can get that pricing. So anyway, we had this concept though too that there's economies of scale and like just schools sharing services and stacking routes, sharing routes, doing call center together, doing routing together, doing some of the other functions, vendor management together, and that's again what formative does. But this idea that where we in a market where there aren't a lot of vendors or the vendors aren't performing well, that schools could actually collaborate, pool their assets, pool their resources, and create their own operation, create their own operator, buy buses. And if you could figure out the structure to govern and coordinate that, and formative, we feel like we're in a good position that we could help schools with some of those functions that they may not be as good at. If they don't have a Dave Dillman, like we could do the communication, we could provide technology, we could help with the routing and so on. But then they could, yeah, control their own destiny and get some of these outcomes that Dave has achieved. Um, but it requires then some kind of structure. You got to collaborate and figure out a way to govern uh, the entity, the structure, legal structure and form of this entity. To how is it managed? To whom does it report? How is it funded? You've got to figure out the insurance puzzle, and that's different state by state. You've got to have capital to buy the assets, and then you need reserve capital for certain things like maintenance because it's a lumpy thing. It's not a smooth thing, and the big guys like First Student, they've got huge pools of capital for assets and for insurance, and they self-insure and so on. And so they are able to weather the ups and downs, and then keep their fleet updated, reduce risk, and so on. And then there's these things like Dave talked about, like those numbers that you gave, Dave, were pretty good in my experience compared to districts, like 80 applications or 80 interviews to 20 finalists to 4 drivers after it's all said and done, or 20 offers to 4 drivers. Those numbers are actually really good. So it's a tough marketplace out there, and it's complicated to qualify a driver, train a driver, keep a driver, on top of a whole lot of other complexities. So where we tried to start it in a couple of instances, the closest we got, we actually started running collaborative service in Indianapolis with a group of charter schools, and we came up with our partner, the Mind Trust, out there, this idea of what is an illegal entity in Indiana called an interlocal entity, which is kind of like when a group of communities come together and they want to start a fire station or something, or a fire service, right? They have it's kind of a public entity that's a collaboration of other entities. So these charter schools could create an interlocal entity, and then they would each have a seat on the board to govern it. They'd agree on a sort of funding structure. And so this was the concept, and we had 2 charter schools that each had their own buses, and they were each running in-house service, but they couldn't sustain the costs, and they really struggled. So they wanted to get some capital to buy new assets and then find ways to collaborate and then do service for themselves and other schools to get offsetting revenue. And we helped them develop that business plan such that they could achieve those cost savings. That's that key element that Dave talked about, how they could make the economics work, is they're doing services for other schools now, right? That's a big part of it. But what ended up happening was, so we had arranged for, these 2 schools that had the buses. In order to make it work, we needed their routes to stack with both each other and with this other school, right? So each of the schools had to agree to even a minor shift in their bell times. And then each of the schools had to agree, in order to get these benefits by, providing service for this other school, they had to agree to shorten their routes into like a 60-minute time window. Whereas their culture had been, their experience had been that they were running routes like 90 minutes or longer across Indianapolis, and picking up every kid at their door. But they wanted to embark on, having the hard conversation with their families and saying, we've got to move to a more hub stop, community stop based model. But the benefits are going to be, we're going to get new buses, and the school's going to save money, and we can put the money back into the classroom. And so everyone was bought in on this vision, and we'd sort of road mapped and had an MOU to launch this interlocal entity. but the kind of legal process of establishing the entity and agreeing on the board structure and everything was delayed, and ended up lagging the start of the school year. So we kind of launched, on a handshake. And then as soon as the school year launched, a few weeks later, even the demands of enrollment, the desire to keep, the accommodating service that they had and extend the routes kind of blew the whole thing up. And it ended up, each of the schools that were providing the service, you know, expressed intent to back out. And so the school that was getting the service essentially got the notice Dave got, which was that your vendor, in 30 days, you don't have service. And so then we tried and worked with another vendor and Indianapolis Public Schools to piece together service for this other school that was supposed to get the service from the new entity. And it fell through, and each of the other schools just continued to serve themselves. Um, and so that the collaboration fell apart because they couldn't, we didn't have that structure codified. And the community wasn't ready for what they needed to do in order to make that collaboration work and make it stick. The insurance was going to work with the interlocal entity. That was required for that to work. In other places, what we found is, and this is when we've explored the idea in Phoenix, and now I think this is kind of our new model that we think is preferred, is actually establishing, finding kind of a core singular entity as an anchor, if you will. So this is again a new strategy we explored in Indianapolis too, with a school that had some assets and had a critical mass of buses themselves or service needs themselves. So a school that had like 15 routes, let's say, or 10 routes at least, right? That they could kind of be the anchor tenant, and then you'd find the other schools to the complementary demand. But then that school could create a new entity, a sister entity, much like a lot of districts do or charters do for facilities, right? Kind of a sister company to maybe own a building. The charter school leases the building, kind of like that structure. So we had fleshed out a plan to set up a new nonprofit entity, associated a sister company with this school, and then develop the business plan. This school had the capital in their reserve. They were going to buy the assets and do this. But again, the barrier in this instance was just kind of figuring out the insurance. The insurance brokers were dubious and didn't want to provide the coverage. And so we ran out of time and we couldn't launch it. I mean, it's still, we have hope to do it, but because it was a new thing in Indiana, this concept, they were willing to cover the school, but not, this other entity doing service for another school with the school's assets. And so where the assets resided, control of the entity, the structure of the entity, the insurance market in the state, these things all played a factor. That school that I'm talking about in Indianapolis, another is different from the ones that kind of fell apart the first time we started it. The other one that I'm talking about in Indianapolis, they had plenty of capital. That's not something that a lot of schools have, a giant fund balance that they could, apportion to buy a bunch of assets. But so that's another reason why sometimes having a third party funder or something can be super, super helpful. Practical experience I have with challenges with driver retention. We had a school partner in Minnesota doing this and actually working with a vendor partner who was using their buses, leasing the school's buses. This is another model, leasing the school's buses to go and serve other schools and then giving the school a slice of the revenue. So they kind of created the route stacks. But then the school had to find these drivers. The school started out with 5 and encountered, worse numbers, worse success than Dave had getting drivers and keeping them. And their driver supply just whittled away to the extent that they just had to scrap the in-house option and go all outsourced because they couldn't retain a driver workforce in the school. So those are just some examples of, and then of course, I'll say we've got a few schools and others interested and kind of exploring different options, different business plans, but a lot of these barriers are the things that hold us up. In particular, just finding to make the business work, you've got to find other schools that your system or this entity can serve to basically split the cost, share the cost, or bring in that revenue. So that's been so far the formative experience. But Dave, I can't take credit for Dave, but again, just a remarkable success story, and I think a real exemplar of how others could do it. Okay, success factors. All right, Dave, why don't you kind of summarize some of these things and others from your experience, just to recap as we close out. What does it take to do this?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, one of the first things is it takes everyone on the team to be on board because it's not going to be easy. Uh, but there are huge wins, operationally, recruiting wise, for your school, for others. Um, finding the team is always interesting. I've learned, especially as I step outside of especially in the driver market, when you're dealing with commercial drivers, it's I've had to at our organization, there was always salary positions for everyone. And as I started growing my operations team, I was convincing HR and my executive director that no, we need to have hourly. But obviously, once you have hourly people, they think in hourly terms rather than yearly, like teachers and other professionals do, which is hard enough for some people to get their mind around. And then you deal with drivers, and drivers are like totally different from anything else you've ever dealt with. So, as soon as you can assume that you don't know what you're gonna, like what to expect, and just learn as much as you can. And honestly, if you have other schools that have drivers, or you have a friend who's a commercial driver, say they're a truck driver, somebody that you just know that you can bring them in on the process, all the better. So one of the big things I've even learned is that when it comes to hiring at Abundant for our drivers, um, I'm not very involved. I just ask my questions after the interviews and hear what the answers, if they match with our core values, so that the management doesn't get too excited about one person and then it's a yes or a no with moving forward. But I've also learned as well operationally that we've ended up in the last year where we've got a very strange mix of our drivers where we have some that can only work mornings, some that can only work evenings, generally, some that can work 4 days a week, 3 days a week. And at first, it seemed like it was an awful lot of operational work in order to make pull off our routes. But the flexibility it has given us, having a bunch of drivers that can all work different days, and they may say they can't work in the afternoon, but if you call them up, they can generally fill in. So start really thinking outside the box. Don't think in a box when it comes to any of this. And that will be a very successful. I say sleep on generally it. The other aspect would be get if you have an original inclination as to the vision for it and you pivot from it, I keep finding that I always end up back where I originally intended to be. It's just a couple degrees in a different direction, but overall it's there. Establishing partnerships, find a phenomenal broker. That was huge for me. So my broker that I went to was with the school that I worked with, another one that we were going to work with for route services. It was amazing because first year in doing it for Abundant Transportation, we're a nobody. We've got no business history. None of the normal insurers that you want to work with, Philadelphia, any of them would talk to us. But our broker got everybody in their office so excited about what we were doing that when the executives from our current insurer came into their office to do a big, like, yearly check, they convinced them to take us. So finding partnerships, on the broker side, for insurance, other schools I think are huge as well. Right now, for me, um, before we even started our own internal transportation, what Empower did is when we started, we were third through fifth grade, and then we added a grade every year after that until we got to high school. And then what we started finding, like everybody knows here, was third grade. We were already so far behind with our demographics, so we ended up dropping down to K2. But before we did that, we partnered with a school that was K2, and we shared bus routes for them with them. So that was a sister school. Now it's always interesting and it's always requires deep partnership. I think the other partnership where, like Carl said, you could really make a lot of headway. And I'm trying to do this with my charters that I work with as well. Can you shift your time so you're not owning the route fully for the day? I think that is the biggest way that you can collectively make, I mean, honestly, the bottom line for every school better is by being able to do that. Plus, going back to operational team, um, I've said this in other meetings as well. I won't get too deep into it. But when I originally brought transportation in-house, I thought I'm just going to hire drivers. They're going to be full-time and we'll put them in operations. They're going to clean. They're going to help with lunch and recess. That was awful. It was truly awful because they just wanted to drive, but they wanted full-time and they wanted benefits. And then I'm looking at my operations associates, facility people, and they're working really hard and they're making $10 less an hour than these people are making, and it just was horrifying. Plus, when it came to dealing with brand new teachers internally in our organization, seeing that we were hiring drivers at X amount. Well, that was around the same price of what they were making hourly as a brand new teacher. So there's all these factors that come in. So, I mean, honestly, if I could, I think really, uh, if you can do it like Carl said, where you could collectively bargain with other schools and bring them together to then start in outside, that's going to help you so much with your teachers. It's going to help you with flexibility on hiring because you may not be bogged down in your hiring process. Liability wise, it's going to save you a ton when it comes to potentially if something were to happen, who are they going to go after? The transportation company or not? And if you're going to get into this, we spent lots of money with lawyers trying to figure out how we can make it an actual IRS nonprofit. And it was a 509A3. It's a supporting entity, a type 3. So if you're going to get into it, get it into that requires schools to be members. We could have a whole thing about that. Spent too many tens of thousands of dollars figuring that out. But um, I mean, that that's where that's at. When it comes to innovative funding and revenue strategies, school bus routes, if you can provide them for other schools, private schools, other schools. I mean, honestly, I run my routes so close to the margins for my schools that I contract with. My school bus routes, or sorry, my field trips and sports trips are where we have our cushion. Now, that's that's not the best business model, but we didn't go into this to make money. We went into this to try and innovate transportation and open up avenues so that students from anywhere weren't meeting a barrier to get to the school that they want to go to. So field trips are huge for that. And they'll do better than you could ever assume. I know that one of the reasons we went externally, none of our insurers would let us provide transportation services for other schools internally, which I'm sure is going to be across the board. But at the end of the day, it's flexibility, thinking outside the box. Don't don't ever, you think you're going to do it one way, and at the end of it, you essentially end up at the same place, but you're a couple degrees in it, further off, but you're still where you want to be.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. Yeah, I mean, the I think you highlighted there, how you've kind of you overcame the insurance barriers, encountered some of the driver challenges and came up with, recognized that the idea of job sharing to have a driver full-time was a lot harder than if you can find, the operational tiered route to better use the asset and the driver and just let them be a
Mhm.
driver, right? And so I think that underscores just where that's, and if you just do the job sharing, then you've got an idle asset that could be making you money. The other thing that, we built into the business model with this school in Indianapolis, which is again still a good one, it just hasn't launched yet, is this idea of profits where, it's not a profitable entity, it's a nonprofit entity, but insofar as you can make the operation run and self-sustain, then you can take profits into, I guess, three buckets. One is cash reserve. So I have on here inadequate, reserves, and resulting in deferred maintenance. And you kind of get into a vicious cycle of you
Yeah.
end up, well, let's not do that repair. We got to save some money, but then you end up, next year with a catastrophic set of repairs or an engine replacement, and all of a sudden it's a huge expense. So having that cash reserve is key. So you can take profits, add it to a reserve if, or excess and add it to a reserve. You can also pass it to yourself, your school and your customer schools as savings. Right. And then it's money going back into the classroom. And so that's the goal. So it's still important to have that, field trip revenue, and you could feel great about offering partner schools field trips at better pricing than the market and still, getting that extra for your own cash reserve. I think,
Right.
it's so to start, it's finding, these partners and aligning on goals, coming up with that governance structure, making sure in your state and, whether it's a nonprofit or an interlocal entity or whatever, it's, it's set up correctly, governed correctly, and that your insurance broker is a partner in that part too. So we thought we had a great insurance broker in Indiana, who was very creative and helped us set up the whole thing. But then still the carriers balked at it. But so it just underscores how much planning and how many different kind of, threshold decision makers that are not in your control kind of can weigh in on how what's possible. Um, Overestimating initial demand. This was the part with this school in Indianapolis where we just thought more schools would be willing to sign on because there was a dearth of vendors, and they'd be willing to maybe do some micro shifts in their bell times. And we've had a hard time finding that. So that's one of the barrier. They had the capital. We figured out the structure there, but just we couldn't. We needed to find like 3, 4 schools to sign on to do it with this other school as the, becoming the empower, if you will, in this example. And we haven't been able to kind of piece that together just yet. And then just, yeah, thinking about all these items and project planning it out and hopefully giving yourself more than 60 days. But Dave had to do it under the gun. But it takes a long time to buy buses. It might take months and months to get them. And it takes a long time to find and qualify and hire drivers. And then, launch everything. You probably have to eat some costs and have them on staff for a period of time before they actually start driving. So while they're training and so on. So a lot of considerations, a lot of complexities, but I mean, I think as Dave shows, and I still believe it's worth pursuing because we need more good providers in the marketplace and schools need better solutions.
Yeah.
That's what we believe. And so I think this is an idea, worth pursuing and continuing to learn from. So thank you, Dave. That we're over time. I hoped I could get it in under 45 minutes. I think I want to reserve the Q&A maybe to folks can throw it in the chat now if you've got stuff and we'll respond to you. Otherwise, what I'll suggest is to reach out. So Dave, I think you saw the deck. I hope it's okay to share your email.
Yeah.
Uh, and I'm sure in mine here, happy to have more conversation with anyone who is interested in this. And also let us know, we had started with a group of some of these schools who were interested at various stages of thinking about this concept, kind of a working group. And I want to fire that up a little again with some of our schools that want to get more serious about it and just to have a a learning community that's coming together once a quarter, a couple times a year, just to share ideas and how's it going, and brainstorm with one another as you're trying to pull off some version of this. So if you'd like to be a part of that, let us know. And also, we've got some other related resources, including where this webinar will go is on the Formative Student Mobility Hub. So just building a resource hub here of interesting topics in student mobility, and hope you'll check that out. So thank you to Dave, and thanks everyone for attending. I hope it was interesting and useful, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Have a great afternoon, everyone.